So Sabine Hossenfelder is a German theoretical physicist, and she has an interesting short video on YouTube where she discusses the existence of God. So let's take a look at it, and I'll pause from time to time to make a few comments.
Today we will talk about whether God exists. I know that some of you have been wondering what has happened to me that I go on about this, but I swear at the end of this video it will all make sense. First, of course, I have to be clear what kind of God I'm talking about. I'm talking about the old-fashioned personal God, the one who listens to prayers and who tells you how to be a good person and who sorts the good from the bad in afterlife and so on.
Well, I would actually like to hear her talk about the God who is supposed to have created space-time, matter, and energy and the laws of physics. And the reason that I would rather hear her talk about that one is because she's a theoretical physicist, and it's a little bit closer to her area of at least discussion. Now, I understand she doesn't believe in such a God, but at least I think the kind of God she describes here is not the one that I think is the most relevant to scientific discussions. It's more the God who's the creator of space, time, matter, and energy and the laws of physics. But let's continue.
Some variants of this God are in actual conflict with evidence. Say, if you believe that evolution does not happen or that praying cures cancer and so on. If you want to defend such beliefs, you are in the wrong channel. Goodbye. I will assume that you are here because you, as I, want to understand what we can learn from nature. So ignoring evidence is not an option. What we have then is a God who is consistent with all our observations, but who himself does not result in any additional observable consequences.
Okay, but the God who has created the universe itself is a massive observation. We can observe there's this huge thing out here that we live in, and it's composed of space, time, matter, and energy, and seems to be controlled by the laws of physics, and it appears to have had a beginning. So it seems to be the consequence of something else. And so if you postulate some sort of a supermind behind the universe, some sort of a creator, God that's the creator of space, time, matter, and energy and the laws of physics, then indeed it does have an observable consequence. We're talking about the universe here.
If you want to explain observations, then the scientific theories of the day are the best you can do.
Well, I would say we shouldn't limit ourselves to just science when it comes to explaining observations. There may be let's take this as representing science. This is our scientific methodology. But our scientific methodology, and we call that science. I would just define science as our method to try and figure out how nature works. Okay, so we have a method that we go about using to figure out how nature works. But if we run into a case where we don't seem to be able to apply science to it, science itself is based on something more fundamental, which I'm going to call logic here. So logic should not be confused with science. Science is contingent on logic. But if you have a situation where science is not involved, you still should be able to use logic. And what I'm talking about here are certain axioms of logic. For example, the axiom of logical non-contradiction. And that is where the scientific method gets its principle of falsification from. It actually is based on a more fundamental axiom in logic that we describe as the principle of non-contradiction. Also, our scientific methodology is based or assumes another fundamental axiom of logic. It's the principle of logical inference, so that you can actually take some premises, and those premises can logically entail something, or you can make a logical inference from those premises. So in science, we have certain observations. We might have some premises that go along with that, and from that we can infer a conclusion, which we do all the time in science. So my point is this, is that science is not the only tool we have in the toolbox. We have another more fundamental tool, when we run into a dead end with science, the scientific method, we still have logic. And we can use that to infer conclusions even if science itself is having a problem in that area.
Adding God on top does not make the theories any more useful. By useful, I mean concretely that a theory allows you to calculate patterns in data in a way that is quantifiably simpler than just collecting the data. Example, the Standard Model of particle physics. It allows you to calculate what happens in particle collisions at the Large Hadron Collider. Now, you can say, I take the Standard Model plus the hypothesis that it was made by God. But adding God does not simplify the calculations. So God is superfluous, not wrong, but unnecessary. The scientific approach is then to prefer the Standard Model without God. This is, of course, nothing else but Occam's razor. You make a theory as simple as possible. Without this requirement, science just does not work, because you would be allowed to add all kinds of unnecessary clutter to your hypothesis.
Okay, I'm a big fan of Occam's razor, and I agree with her on this point. Occam's razor basically is go with the simplest explanation that actually does the job, and don't be adding extra stuff that doesn't do any work. So when it comes to the Standard Model, we're trying to understand how particles, subatomic particles, work in physics. And so we have this model that we've put together, but there's an underlying assumption here, and I think both her and I would agree that what's going on with subatomic particles is basically controlled by the laws of physics. So we might not know exactly what these laws of physics are yet, but we observe enough to put together a standard model here. But when we're talking about the laws of physics, yeah, we don't really need to add God. Adding God into, let's say I see a ball bounce off a wall at some particular angle, and I can use the laws of nature or understanding of the laws of nature to explain why it left at that particular angle. And adding God into that really doesn't help my explanation, doesn't make it any simpler, and I would agree with her on that. But there still is the remaining question, well, where do the laws of physics come from? That's when postulating some sort of a God might have some utility here. And the reason that I say that is that the very first mention of the laws of nature that we have in human history recorded is actually in the book of Job in the Bible, and the book of Job is thought by scholars to be the oldest book in the Bible, dating to roughly maybe 4,000 years ago. And in the book of Job, God's talking to Job, and he points out that he has created laws that govern the universe and what happens on earth here, laws of nature. And so the universe runs according to these laws. And the point is that if God creates the laws of nature, he doesn't need to intervene then in those laws of nature to help, let's say, the subatomic particles do what they're supposed to do. Laws of physics have been created to do that. But we still need to back up as curious beings who think about things and wonder about stuff, and then ask the question, well, where did the laws of physics come from upon which we base the Standard Model, so to speak?
Now, as we discussed previously, scientists say that something exists if it is an element of a theory that is useful to explain observations.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Scientists say something exists if it is useful as an element of theory to explain observations. But I think it needs to be pointed out here, this might be a problem, for her at least, because we have this huge observation. It's the universe. There is a universe that exists, and it seems to have had a beginning. So one theory that's useful to explain that is the existence of God, of some sort of a creator, a supermind out there that brought space-time, matter, and energy and the laws of physics into existence. So since God is useful to explain the observation, the ultimate observation, which is the universe, then by her definition, then God would exist. And so I think she would probably for sure disagree that God doesn't exist, but then she would have to rethink her definition of existence. And I I would tend to be a little nervous about that definition as well, because the mere fact that something is helpful in explaining an observation does not mean that it actually exists. Let's say the square root of -1, for example, is useful to help do calculations, but we're not actually postulating that the square root of -1 therefore exists. Not in any physical sense anyways.
The Higgs boson exists in this very sense, and so do black holes and gravitational waves. On the other hand, if something is not useful to explain observations, as is the case with God, science does not say it does not exist. Instead, it doesn't say anything about whether it exists or not. It cannot say anything because science is about what is observable.
Okay, and I would agree with her on this. Science is about explaining what is observable. And so, for example, I would say beautiful music that you hear, an observation, so to speak, includes auditory sensors, which we call our ears. And we can hear beautiful music, and then stuff happens and we say, that's beautiful music. But if someone made up a rule and said you are only allowed to search for beautiful music with a flashlight, now I'm talking about the actual music itself, not the symbols we use on a musical sheet to record beautiful music, but the beautiful music itself. So if you made up a rule that says you're only allowed to use flashlights to search for beautiful music, well, it's totally the wrong tool. And in the same way, she has a point here in that science is the wrong tool to examine or do analysis on God. It's just simply, its proper use is to figure out how nature works, not about some God or the creator of nature and how that works.
Personally, I'm not sure what sense it makes to postulate the existence of something that has no observable consequences, but it is certainly something you can believe in if you want to. It's just that science cannot say anything about it.
And I would agree that science cannot say anything about it. Maybe I might agree with that, unless the creator of the universe has actually interacted in the physical universe. Then science might be able to detect these perturbations or these interactions, because now something physical is being affected here. But as I said before, if science cannot say anything about it, we still have the foundation of science, which is logic itself. So we can use logic to say something about the existence of God. And when we apply that to the biggest observation of all, the origin of space-time, matter, and energy, and the laws of physics, in other words, the origin of nature, we're left with a logical choice. Either the cause of nature is natural or it's not natural. And we know that it's logically impossible for nature to cause itself to come into existence. That's logically impossible. Science cannot violate the axioms of logic unless we want to throw away our scientific method. So whenever you have two options and there's one option eliminated, the other one's the one to go with, and that is there is something that's not natural out there. Something that's supernatural, that's actually the origin and foundation of physical reality. And all I've done here is just use cold, hard logic. So logic itself might have something to say about this kind of thing we could call God that's not dependent on space, time, matter, and energy and the laws of physics. And it might be timeless. And there's a number of other things we could derive logically about it. But we'll move on here.
So, as some of you have pointed out correctly, God could be said to exist in a different way than, say, elementary particles. Some have suggested to call it immaterial existence, but I find this misleading because space and time are also immaterial, but they do exist in the scientific sense. Some have suggested to call it non-physical existence, but this raises the impression that it has something to do with physics in particular, which is also misleading.
Well, not necessarily. If we're going to say that God is non-physical, what we're saying is that physics has nothing to do with God. At least God is not dependent on physics, or physics doesn't control how God works. Physics is out of the picture, is what we're saying. If God is non-physical, then physics is out of the picture as far as being able to study or describe or analyze God by the scientific method. We're just using totally the wrong tool to examine God, as a flashlight is totally the wrong tool to search for beautiful music.
What it really is a non-scientific type of existence, or let us just call it what it is. It's a religious type of existence. God exists in the religious way. An element of a hypothesis that does not result in observable consequences exists in the religious way.
Okay, I think we really need to discuss more than just those two options that either exist in a scientific way or a religious way. And the reason that I think we need to talk about that is the axioms of logic don't exist in a scientific way. They're not something that we can weigh or fire through a charged particle accelerator to determine what its mass is or how much energy can be produced by it. The axioms of logic exist by her definition because they're exactly highly useful. In fact, they're indispensable when it comes to explaining things. But yet they're not composed or dependent upon space, time, matter, and energy and the laws of physics. So then by her conclusion here, it either exists in a scientific way or a religious way, she would have to conclude that the axioms of logic themselves exist in a religious way. But I'd be uncomfortable with that, and I'm pretty sure she would be as well. So there has to be other categories of existence that need to be discussed here, not just existing in a scientific way or a religious way, but what about in a logical way, for example?
So here's my next homework assignment. Does the multiverse exist? I think most of you will understand now what I'm getting at here. If you are not sure just what the multiverse is, I have another video upcoming in a few hours.
Okay, so her video is essentially over where she's discussing the existence of God. And I find it interesting, but I am both a scientist and a philosopher, so when I listen to something like this, I can agree with a lot of what she says as a scientist. But as a philosopher, I'm aware that there's more to reality than just, for example, the laws of physics and space, time, matter, and energy. And as I pointed out, there are, say, the axioms of mathematics and logic, which are essential to the way we function in this universe, but yet are not physical in that sense. And then, of course, logic itself begins to get concerned with the origin of space, time, matter, and energy and the laws of physics. She hasn't really addressed these things, to be fair. Probably some eventually maybe she has already in another video, and I'm going to look through them to see if I can find it, and if not, she probably will be at some point. Just one more thing. Don't hesitate to check out my website. It's at kirkdurston.com. And also you can check out my other YouTube videos, and if you like them, give them a thumbs up, and don't hesitate to subscribe. Bye for now.